Hello and welcome to today's LinkedIn Live, where you've got me, Stephanie, the founder of the ADHD Advocate, and we've got one of our coaches, Alexander Smith, who is joining us today, and he will be talking about the blue zones, which I'm really excited to hear about. This is the great thing about having a team of coaches, is that they very much enrich our knowledge, all the other coaches' knowledge, which makes the ADHD Advocate just really well placed to help and support ADHDers with this shared pool of knowledge and experience. So Alex, thank you for joining us. How's it going today?
Going well, yeah, looking forward to doing this presentation.
Yeah, so I'm going to hand over to Alex, to his capable hands. And Alex, I guess you want to get started. Firstly, I guess I'll just ask you the question. So how come it's important for us ADHDers to know about this in particular?
So the blue zones have absolutely nothing to do with ADHD in particular. They arose from a research study that was originally done by the National Geographic, which was led by someone called Dan Buettner. But what it was looking at was like positive outlier communities for life expectancy and mental well-being and physical well-being. And where it's interesting from an ADHD perspective is that a lot of people with ADHD have to do things differently. And often there's quite a lot around things like the hunter in the farmer's world interpretation of ADHD. And quite a lot of what comes up in the blue zones really resonates with quite a lot of things that I find in coaching help my clients to actually construct better lives for themselves with ADHD.
Wow. Okay. So this will be very interesting. So I guess I'll leave it to you to get on with the presentation. Thanks, Alex.
Right. So just to start with, so what the blue zones are, as I say, I'll just repeat myself a little bit. So what the blue zones were, it was originally a research project which was run by Dan Buettner for the National Geographic Society. And it started with an island in Japan called Okinawa. Basically, what they were looking at is that there were certain communities in the world that for markers of life expectancy and the number of centenarians that lived there, but also kind of signs of like both physical and mental well-being in the absence of illnesses in old age. They were like outliers compared to other surrounding areas or other parts of the same continent. And so that sparked a much wider study. And basically they identified 5 different blue zones in different parts of the world and got them on the map here. And they're very disparate. They're kind of across different areas of the world. So 2 of them, and quite a lot of things around things like the Mediterranean diet have originated out of kind of some of these studies as well. So 2 of them were in the Mediterranean area. So one was Icaria in Greece, one was part of Sardinia in Italy. You've got a part of Costa Rica called Nicoya. You've got Loma Linda in California. Loma Linda was their communities of Seventh-day Adventists. So they basically live quite communally and like grow their own food, things like that. The 5th one was the original blue zone, which was an island off Japan called Okinawa. And then what they started to think is, well, you've got 5 very disparate communities. They've got different beliefs and different ideas, but what was it that actually links these communities? And what is it that explains that the fact that life expectancy and like markers of well-being in those communities were markedly different to other areas surrounding them and in the rest of Europe and the rest of the world and the rest of Asia? And then break it down a little bit more. So that in terms of the blue zones, it was very specific groups of people that they found. So in the region of Sardinia, it was something called the Barbaria region. And basically what it is, it's a mountainous highlands region of Inner Sardinia. And in that particular region, it's the world's highest concentration of male centenarians. So you had a huge concentration of people that were over 100 years old. Icaria was an Aegean island, and it's got one of the world's lowest rates of middle-aged mortality, and it's got the world's lowest rate of dementia, or it did have at the time that they studied it. Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica was, what they found is that middle-aged mortality was very, very low. And again, other than Barbaria in Sardinia, it had the 2nd highest concentration of male centenarians. Loma Linda, I've mentioned before, there's a number of these communities of Seventh-day Adventists spread across California, and they're often concentrating in this area of Loma Linda. And again, what they found is that on average, people within these communities lived longer than their 10 years longer than their Californian counterparts in the surrounding areas, in the surrounding towns. And the final one was Okinawa in Japan, where they found that in that kind of population, females over 70 were the longest lived population in the world. So basically, if you got to 70 in like Okinawa, you know, the likelihood of getting to 100 or 105 was much greater than anywhere else in the world. So what they were looking at is that there was something that or some things that these communities were obviously doing right to promote kind of good physical and mental well-being. And then that prompted quite a lot of discussion, and then studies. What they did is they interviewed a lot of the members of these communities, and what they were looking for is things that linked them. So, you know, they're seemingly disparate communities. They're in different areas of the world. They had, a lot of them did have faith systems, but they weren't the same faith systems. They weren't from the same religions. They often had faith-based belief systems, but they weren't all Christian. They weren't all following exactly the same diet. In terms of language, that, you know, there were different languages. So there was nothing that, although there was certain things that basically they did have in common, in terms of like the peoples within these communities, there was a lot of disparities between them. But what they found is that there were nine areas that, what they came up with was what's called a power 9. So there were 9 areas where there was things that these kind of people shared, or the ways in which they lived, you know, they had adopted similar things. So these were the power 9. So one was that they had some form of belonging, or some form of communal belonging. Another one was that they had, families tended to stay close in being kind of quite distinct units, kind of grandparents, kids. It was very multi-generational, and there was a real priority of putting loved ones first. They all had like some form of like, which I'll cover again a bit later, all had some form of like tribal or some form of positive community ethos or community ethic. They all, interestingly, apart from the Seventh-day Adventists, did drink in moderation. So that's where the wine at 5 comes from. They did actually find that kind of drinking a little was actually more protective than not drinking at all. They all followed largely plant-based diets. I mean, some did eat meat, but they basically predominantly plant-based diets. They all adopted this a kind of 80% rule, you know, and it's something that I use quite a lot in coaching as well, like the 80-20 rule, which again I'll cover later. They all have very natural ways of managing, of downshifting and managing stress. And like, so a lot of the things that had within their communities allowed them to live naturally stress-free lives. They all had a sense of purpose and a value. And then quite vitally also for ADHD, right at the top, they all had, they definitely didn't pump iron or go to the gym. They weren't running marathons, but they all had very natural outlets for restlessness. And in the course of their days, they naturally moved. And seeing these links led to a development of what they called the Blue Zones Power 9, which is used quite a lot in terms of like urban development and kind of regeneration of communities and constructing new cities, and also is kind of used quite a lot as an educational tool. So just to kind of elaborate on those Power 9 things, the first one of the Power 9 is moving naturally. So what they found in the Blue Zones is that people that lived within them lived in environments which, just by the nature of their environments, nudged them into moving. You know, a lot of them, they don't pimp iron, they don't pump iron or work out. A lot of them grow their own vegetables. I think in Japan, they were kind of fishermen. You know, a lot of people didn't have natural mechanical, they didn't have mechanical conveniences. So Seventh-day Adventists did actually, you know, believe very much in using quite primitive tools. They use things like mangles and things like that. So they basically, in the course of their daily lives, they were moving, they were exercising, they were getting their 10,000 steps. The other thing that the second one was the sense of purpose. So in the Okinawans are saying that they called ikigao, and the Koreans are saying called plan de vida. But what it meant is that they had a clear community purpose, something that they all woke up for in the morning. And like knowing that purpose, they found they estimate was worth up to 7 years extra life expectancy. Another thing is that they all had ways of managing stress and chronic inflammation. They weren't doing that very kind of actively. They weren't going to see psychiatrists or psychologists, or, you know, they weren't necessarily, but basically the way in which they lived, they had routines that naturally shedded stress. So like the Okinawans pause to remember our ancestors, the Adventists pray, the Icarians followed the kind of classical South European thing of taking a nap. Sardinians did their happy hour, they drank their wine each day, and like the kind of shepherds would get together and drink for an hour every day and exchange stories. They also had something that was actually defined as like what was like the 80% rule. So, and one of the things that they picked up on was which very much on the Japanese community was it's something called Hara-hashi-bu, which is a 2,500-year-old Confucian mantra, which is that they kind of operated in moderation, but they allowed themselves that moderation. So they did allow themselves, they weren't just using deprivation strategies. So like the Confucian mantra was that they kind of stopped eating when their stomach was 80% full. A lot of these communities took their smallest meal in the late afternoon or early evening, and then they didn't eat for the rest of the day. In terms of diet, what they found is that there was a huge variety, but generally speaking, most people had basically beans was the cornerstone of their diet, or other pulses, so like fava beans in some areas, black beans in Costa Rica, soya, lentils were very predominant. Meat was eaten in moderation, mainly meat, pork or chicken. And again, what was very, very striking in all of these communities was the complete absence of processed food. They were very, for different reasons, either by choice or by location, they were very much protected from the encroachment of what for want of a better word, like, you know, modern Western living and modern Western kind of eating habits and eating like junk food, etc. The wine at 5 one, what they found was that in all of the blue zones, other than for the Seventh-day Adventists, that they drank moderately and regularly. So what they found is that moderate drinkers outlived non-drinkers. So particularly the Sardinians, they used to drink something called Cannonau wine with, and I think the key wasn't so much the drinking at all, it was the sense of community. So they basically usually took meals together in all of these communities. Taking meals and eating was a communal experience. So the wine was very much the bond. It wasn't absolutely that they needed to drink wine. It was basically, it was the way in which they bonded with friends, and they kind of, you know, they basically forged their sense of community. And then the last 3 all related to that sense of community. So there was, I think what they found is they all had some form of belonging. So most of the actual blue zones, most of them had some faith-based community. So of the 263 people they interviewed, of the centurions they interviewed, 258 of them had some faith, but critically they didn't have the same faith. So, you know, they weren't all Christian, they weren't all, but and some of their faiths were not necessarily like organized religious faiths. It was more of like a kind of had a worship of like tribal ancestors or something like that. But what they found again was communally attending a faith-based service 4 times a month added around 14 years to their life expectancy and good life expectancy. The two other things linked to that was loved ones first. That what they tended to find is that, unlike in a lot of Western societies, people tended to put families first. It was very multi-generational, so kind of aging parents and grandparents were nearby or at home, tended to commit to a life partner, which again was estimated to add 3 years of life expectancy. And a real investment in children. Children were very present and very kind of active and visible in these communities, so that kind of idea of investing in children with time and love. And then something that often comes up a lot with ADHD as well, the right tribe. What they found is that people were basically either born or created social circles that basically created support networks naturally. They weren't working in isolation. So the Okinawans created something called MALs, which are they established groups of 5 friends in, I think it was their early teens, that basically for the rest of their lives would have a committed role to supporting each other and would meet up weekly to do so. And what they found is that the presence of those social networks promoted and naturally engendered healthy habits. So these kind of networks would either kind of eat together, or they would fish together, or they would grow vegetables together, or recount stories. So there was very much a sense of people operating communally rather than in isolation across all of those communities. So this beggars the big question, kind of, what has this got to do with ADHD? And as a research project, it's got absolutely nothing to do with ADHD, because it wasn't in any way, you know, looking at neurodiversity. It was looking at just wider mental and physical health, and very statistically at life expectancy. But I suppose, where it's very useful and where I kind of use it in both my own management of my own ADHD, but also sometimes conceptually to help my clients in coaching, is in terms of creating the scaffolding and the support networks that are needed to better manage and thrive with ADHD. So, and this is where kind of blue zones can be quite instructive, because I think one of the big things with ADHD is that you really do need to actively give yourself permission to do things differently. A lot of the ways in which education establishments are set up and workplace establishments are set up don't really engender. They work for people, but they don't work very well for ADHD. They often stifle the strengths associated with the condition. They make people operate in a way which is counterintuitive to how they naturally want to operate. And interestingly, they are often set up very differently to the way in which people thrive in the blue zones as well. So the other aspect is, I think with ADHD, that I think when I work with clients, they've got, most of them are heavily reliant on exercise and heavily, they struggle quite a lot where they're sedentary or operating in a vacuum. So I think what you really need with ADHD is outlets for restlessness and also like outlets for creativity and curiosity. So that's the second aspect. Third bit is that what you see a lot in the blue zones is that sense of community, the sense that people don't do things in isolation. They don't do things in a vacuum. There's a lot of extrinsic energy and a lot of community energy around the things that people do. And again, this resonates hugely from an ADHD perspective. I think I would say almost universally, clients I've worked with ADHD are extrinsically motivated or principally extrinsically motivated, which sometimes causes them to panic and look at me kind of with wild-eyed suspicion. But what it doesn't mean is that they're not, that doesn't mean to say that they're all extroverts. There's a lot of introverted people that I work with ADHD, but I think even within that, they tend to, people with ADHD take their energy, both positive and negative, from other people in the environment, much more so than neurotypical people. You've got something which is another whole presentation itself, with this idea of hunters in a farmer's world as well, that basically ADHD itself isn't maladaptive, but it's become maladaptive in kind of modern Western capitalist societies, where you're often working towards much more kind of long-term goals and much more delayed gratification. What's quite interesting about the blue zones is that a lot of them don't have long-term goals. If anything, they are very much, it's what's often said is that people with ADHD are sprinters, not marathon runners. They are operating in sprinter lifestyles. They often, their focuses are daily or weekly. They have very, very kind of communal, kind of faith-based routines. It's a very simple day-to-day living. So again, quite useful to think that a lot of these blue zones where people are thriving, they are actually living as sprinters. So they're actually kind of quite living kind of quite typically to what often works for people with ADHD. And then the final one is one around circadian rhythms. So there's a lot around you could do another whole talk on this, but there's quite a lot of evidence that the chronobiology of people with ADHD and their circadian rhythms are delayed. So a lot of, and one of the best ways that you can often alter that is by getting early morning daylight, by getting early morning exercise, which actually pushes back your chronobiology. So what's quite interesting in the blue zones is that they all operate according to the seasons. So they aren't working at night. They're often not even using artificial light very much. So their rhythms and their kind of circadian rhythms are very much in tune with the areas in which they're living. So that's the kind of link. And then what I've kind of done with it at times, and what I sometimes use in either coaching or presenting is this idea. I've taken the kind of blue zones and looked at those power 9 and almost created like a power 9 for ADHD, and just a set of questions or a set of things to ponder when thinking whether you've got your lifestyle right for ADHD, whether you're managing the condition well. And so taking the first one of these, the move naturally, the kind of things that I'll be asking clients or is often useful for reflecting is, where are your outlets of restlessness? Have you got enough movement in your life? Have you got enough exercise in your life? How are you going to retain interest in what you're doing? A lot of people with ADHD tend to set themselves up to fail by having very intensive commitments. They say, I'll go to the gym 7 days a week. The moment they miss a day, they then don't go to the gym for the rest of that week because they haven't hit their arbitrary target. Or ADHD is also a litany of like drum kits and canoes, like short-lived hobbies. So I think what's quite vital with ADHD is to find ways and people that motivate you to move naturally, to kind of get your steps without actually having to kind of intensively measure them. So that's something that comes across in the blue zones quite a lot. They all exercise a lot. They all move a lot. They're all very, very physically healthy. There's low rates of obesity, but they're not exercising with a big E. They're basically just moving in the context of their daily lives. Second one is purpose. So with purpose, it's what you often find with ADHD is people have got very like emotional based decision-making systems, very values-based decision-making systems. And often if what they're doing is contrary to those values, or they haven't even established their values in the first place, they tend to flounder. So again, the kind of questions I ask in relation to that kind of element of the power 9 is what you're doing personally and professionally aligned to your core values? And if not, ultimately the question is, should you be doing it, or would you be better off doing something else? Another question that often relates to that is just that kind of, it's almost like a confidence-based question. If sometimes people kind of say, if you had like an ultimatum, if you had 6 months to live, or if you had a year to live, what would you be doing if you knew you couldn't fail at it, or you knew it was your last opportunity to do it? And Again, that often gets at things that are very different to what clients are currently doing. Third one around downshift is that basically it's people pleasing is a big element of ADHD, and it's a very logical element of ADHD. If you're getting your energy from other people, if you're getting your energy from outside of yourself, sometimes doing something for, with, or conjunction with somebody else is much easier than doing exactly the same thing under your own steam, because you've got short-term feedback loops around what you're doing. However, a lot of the time, this is what also contributes to clients burning out. You know, it's in people pleasing, they neglect to please themselves or take care of their own well-being. So in terms of that, the kind of questions you would ask around downshifting and managing stress is, you know, where is people pleasing to the detriment of your own well-being? Where do you need to protect time and energy for yourself? And the other thing is, like with burnout, is that it's seeing those red flags. How are you going to stop yourself burning out? How are you going to stop yourself with all of that ADHD energy, like Icarus, flying too close to the sun and burning out, and like basically running out of steam or running out of spoons? Fourth one, the 80% rule, is a question I often ask in coaching is what is enough and no more? I think it's a really big one with them. And in business coaching a lot, I use something called Pareto's law, or the 80-20 law. It's what 20% of your efforts are going to give 80% of the rewards. And this is quite a big one with ADHD, because people tend to have a very high bar of mastery. They tend to be very perfectionistic about how they do things. So the kind of things that you ask there is, you know, and one of the things that I think clients almost universally do is they don't hand things early enough. That they hold on to things for too long, they perfect them for too long. Not only do they struggle to get things done, but what they get done is far exceeds the requirements of what needs to be done. So kind of things you ask with that is, you know, what's enough and no more? What's the point of diminishing returns with this? And also, where's the sweet spot between like deprivation and excess? Sometimes, you know, to break a habit or to establish a good habit, much better to kind of allow yourself some bandwidth, allow yourself some fun, rather than just to absolutely kind of force yourself not to do things. The plant slant, again, this is a huge area, and it's one that I won't even attempt to cover today, because you could write essays, and there have been essays written on this, but diet is very critical to ADHD. I would say, along with medication, if people choose to take it, the holy trinity that you often see in predicting whether people are flourishing with ADHD or struggling, or the things that can tend to change where people go from like hero to zero with ADHD, or zero to hero, are sleep, diet, and exercise. So not necessarily saying that people, you know, should adopt a plant-based diet. I personally eat meat. I enjoy eating meat, but it's basically the questions that, you know, you're often worth pondering is, how is your diet supporting or not supporting your ADHD? Where executive functioning challenges impacting the way in which you eat? Or, I mean, so sometimes that's the other aspect of it. People forget to eat, or when they're hyper focused, or basically that because they haven't, you know, operational challenges or organizational challenges mean that they haven't got anything to eat in the house. So, and that then creates a kind of vicious cycle in which they're kind of eating junk food and heavily processed food, all of which are very, very kind of notable by their absence in the blue zones. And then the other bit is the inflammation bit. I mean, often ADHD doesn't travel alone. I personally have celiac disease, which I've worked with a lot of clients that have got things like Crohn's disease, like other inflammatory conditions. So another thing that's often worth considering is, what role is inflammation playing in your brain fog or some of the executive function difficulties that you're facing? The wine at 5 one is another one that's kind of, again, I think potentially a good strategy for ADHD is to have a break and have wine at 5, but that's not, you know, it's not the alcohol, or the kind of that's not the purpose of the strategy. It's very much kind of thinking about what I often say to clients is, what are your frivolous facilitative indulgences? I mean, sometimes what you tend to find with ADHD is people become very conscious of the fact that they have short-lived hobbies, short-lived interests. They've accumulated canoes and drum kits and diving equipment and all sorts of other things. So as a result, and then often they become hyper defensive, and then basically, and I think sometimes spending money on things that facilitate experiences or facilitate fun or facilitate adventure or movement or creativity are absolutely vital with ADHD. They're not simply protective, they're just necessary to function well. So again, it's, what are your kind of wine at 5 things? Where are your frivolous, or where are your frivolous spending, or the things that you enjoy actually facilitative to your well-being? And another one is, you know, is where would a reward-based strategy serve me better than a deprivation-based strategy? It's like, often I think from an ADHD perspective, there's quite a lot of feedback around, you know, a lot of research into the amount of negative feedback that people have for ADHD, with ADHD, for character flaws that they simply don't have. I think there's quite a famous one that they say that the average person with ADHD has received 12,000 more negative assessments of their character by the age of 18 than someone that's neurotypical. So it's another thing to ponder, you know, in setting up strategies for yourself and scaffolding for yourself. I think carrots, not sticks, are often much more enabling to ADHD motivation. And then the last three that I've grouped together, because the belonging one, the loved ones first, and the right tribe. What you're looking at with there is again, that extrinsic motivation with ADHD. I mean, there's a lot about ADHD and rejection sensitive dysphoria, but the opposite is also true as well. So if you were to kind of put the opposite to rejection sensitive dysphoria, it would be something like probably acceptance sensitive euphoria. So basically, just as people with ADHD tend to be shut down by rejection, they're energized by enthusiasm and support around what they're doing, and that is that extrinsic energy that often enables them to do bigger things and better things with their lives. So the kind of things that, you know, I look at here, which again link to the blue zones, is where can people is thinking about where you can ask for help and get more support. What environments energize you and ignite interest? There's a huge situational variability with ADHD and an environmental ADHD, environmental variability. When I think about my own life, I could absolutely travel around India for months at a time, you know, and never miss a train, never miss a boat, never miss a bus. Doesn't mean to say that I can get my keys, wallet, and phone together and get to work on time. The difference is that the first environment and the kind of the combination of urgency, the interest, the energy was engaging to me. The second one is destimulating and wasn't engaging. So again, there's a huge scope to change the environment in which you do things. Another one is who do you need to surround yourself with and not surround yourself with. You know, people need cheerleaders with ADHD. They need people to kind of energize them. They need people to like bounce ideas off. A lot of people with ADHD are very conceptual learners, very collaborative learners. They clarify their own thinking by bouncing that thinking off other people. Another one is the interest-based. You know, we're working with an interest-based nervous system here. So what you're looking at is where do people who share my interests hang out? You know, where are my natural allies, or where are the kind of people that are going to ignite and develop my curiosity? And that's another big one. I mean, a lot of people find it much easier with you know, a lot of people with ADHD say that they're terrible at small talk. I used to dread going to weddings, but I absolutely like being able to kind of interact with people in areas where I've got interest and where I can check in and out according to that interest. Another one is like kind of in terms of like right tribe is learning to advocate for yourself and set boundaries for yourself. So what do I need people to understand about my ADHD? That's not saying that you're being an apologist for ADHD or saying that ADHD is an excuse for everything, but it's being able to actually communicate what you need to operate on your own terms. And then the final one is, you know, where do I feel comfortable and able to operate on my own terms? You know, what do I need from other people? What do I need from the environment? What do I need to give myself permission to do to operate in accordance with my ADHD brain, rather than to kind of operate in the way I think I should operate? I think all of those, what you're looking at is basically trying to get ADHD from that perspective of difference rather than deficit. It's a very complex condition to manage. It's a very inconsistent and frustrating condition to manage. But there are huge strengths associated with it, and there's a huge situation and environmental variability in which those strengths come to the fore, or kind of or present as strengths or weaknesses accordingly.
Thanks, Alex. That was such an informative presentation. I mean, I've never seen these 9 blue zones, but I love how you've been able to integrate them into the ADHD coaching, because yeah, you can see just how directly relevant they are to helping ADHDers get out of their own way. I love the idea of the routines, building in, you know, that kind of self-care in, you know, as part of the routine, as a lifestyle, because like you said, you know, if we've got a choice, we generally tend to not prioritize those things that are actually good for us. So I love how that's a routine. There were so many things there, particularly in relation to the belonging aspects, because obviously ADHD and connection and being part of something, the body double strategy is absolutely key. So thank you so much for sharing. It's We've got some, hopefully get some comments. I've asked everyone to kind of answer the questions, particularly on the belonging aspect, to answer those questions and share their answers with everyone, right? Because again, using the body double strategy, this is how we can kind of move forward and make changes. But Alex is amazing. And if anyone is interested in getting one-to-one coaching support from Alex, you can book an intro call with him via our website, www.thehdadvocate.com. But Alex, thank you so much. And yeah, I think we're going to hear from you again later this month, aren't we?
Pleasure. I've got 2 more to come. Yeah. So if you're not bored of me yet, you'll get another 2. So hopefully.
Not at all. It's amazing. So helpful. I think you're doing managing energy, I think was one of them.
I'm doing one around looking at ADHD from the perspective of managing energy rather than time, and another one about advocacy and managing upwards with ADHD and managing your own manager with ADHD, which very much links more to my executive coach rather than my kind of pure ADHD coach. Yeah, and we're really looking forward to, we're exhibiting at the London Business Show later next month. Alex and I will be there. So yeah, he's perfectly positioned to help businesses manage their ADHD, whether it's the employees, the managers themselves. So thank you, Alex. That was really helpful. And we'll see you later this month.